Hey friends, I'm Sabrina, the rookie around here. John and Dick are the old school American fans of F1. Thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation we had about the 2023 Spanish Grand Prix. Upgrades, track change, jumbled up grid, weather changes, a really great driver leading the field, good driving, and good passing. If you can't tell by now, I really enjoy debriefing races with the guys, and this Barcelona race was no exception. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, gentlemen, we have just completed the Barcelona 2023 race. 1 week after Monaco, it seems like it's a very different race. I think there's some notable things about it that we can unpack, but just going from a street circuit to a permanent circuit, and then apparently there was a major change made to this circuit. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Specifically, I'd like to do a little bit of a front loading of an overview, and then we can go into some more general stuff. So my first question. Free practice, 1, 2, 3. Was there anything that interested you guys that you feel like we should discuss? And if not, tell me why you don't. So I'm going to lead with you, John. Why don't you tell us, free practice worth our time?
Not particularly. FP1 and FP2 kind of made you think that maybe there was a little bit of something going on, the development. We might be able to see some things there. But by the time you got to P3, it really kind of stacked up like you would expect it to. So there wasn't a whole lot going on there that I thought was too interesting.
So then where do you think it goes to? Quali?
Oh, yeah. Qualifying was very interesting because of the weather and the changing conditions. The temperatures were cooler than expected, and that became very interesting and affected the entire weekend.
Dick, do you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Obviously, we wound up with a very strange looking grid. It's just not that unusual to, have a grid that I call the Noah's Ark grid. Everything's 2 by 2. You got 2 Red Bulls, 2 Ferraris, 2 Aston Martins, whatever, right? That's not what we got this time. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. And I think some of it is that, the drivers or the particular driver's side of the garage, some got it better than others because the track was running cooler than everybody thought it would. And if the track's cooler, that obviously has things to do with your tires. What kind of starting tire pressure do you even start with? And you can feel half a pound of tire pressure sometimes. So, and if I can feel half a pound of tire pressure, then those guys surely would feel it. But then it also would have impact your aerodynamic settings as well. So because the air density would have changed, right, from the last time that they were running, which was just really 2.5 hours earlier or something like that. So, so I think that's kind of the umbrella over which everything landed. But then you had dampness on the track in certain spots that caught several of the guys out, including Alonso, who went off in Q1. Damaged his floor, and we got a couple of different times where we saw the view of his poor mechanics underneath his car with racer tape, taping the diffuser and all the strakes and all that back into the position that they needed to be. And I'm sitting there kind of going, okay, we're talking about a 200-mile-an-hour breeze here, and the car is probably touching the track at certain locations, and they're looking for duct tape to hold this thing together. But the way the rules are written is that, like for the race, they had to go in with that damaged floor that had been duct taped back together again. So it wasn't optimal. And
really, I didn't realize that because of Parc Ferme.
Yep, they can't touch it, and so they had.
I'm sorry. Can you help me understand? I thought if it gets damaged, you can fix the thing that is.
Nope.
Oh.
Nope. Now, if you want to fix it, you can, but then you have to start from pit lane.
Right.
Which we saw with both Leclerc and Sargent. So anyway, here's the thing. Alonso flat out, I mean, he was super honest. He said, it was my mistake in Q1, and in Q3, I was headed to either P2 or P3, and I did the same thing again, and I ran wide, and I lost all sorts of time, and so I deserve the qualifying position I got, which, kudos to him, because of the honesty. He didn't place any blame anywhere except on himself.
Mhm.
So then you have the story of, Perez having his issues and winding up starting 11th. Charles Leclerc didn't even make it out of Q1, and then was so upset with the way the car was working that he demanded changes. So they violated the Park for May rules, worked on the car, and he, in his mind, the car was so bad, it wasn't even worth bothering starting. Where he qualified, he'd rather start from pit lane. So that, and we'll talk about that some more in a little bit. The other side of it is the upgrades that were brought for McLaren and for AlphaTauri, at least work at Barcelona. Norris doing as well as he did in qualifying at least shows that the car has qualifying pace, which is good. Race pace remains to be seen, because of course his race really was over after about the second or third turn. But yeah, I honestly think that the story of this weekend was quali, because whatever the field stacked up with in quali, everybody kind of said, yeah, Sergio's going to come through. It'll be interesting to see how Leclerc does. Can Fernando sort of finish where he started? And, those were kind of the storylines that everybody was talking about. And it was all set in quali, because everybody knew what Max was going to do. And Max did what Max does. So that's what stuck out for me.
Okay. All right. So then that's quali. Let's talk about the race itself, kind of dovetailing from what you just said. Was there anything that surprised you overall when you think back about this race and the actual Grand Prix?
Oh, I'll go first.
Okay. Yes, please.
So there were two things. First of all, I don't know if you saw the onboard camera, but when Sergio was coming up through the field, he went to go past Joe, who he was also in. Joe was in DRS and Sergio was in DRS, right? I can't remember who Joe was behind, but anyway, it's not like he's a sitting duck with his wing closed. It's open. Sergio goes past him like I thought maybe something had broken on Joe's car. Because it was like, what the hell was that? And I was just sort of like, nobody has a chance against these Red Bulls until they figure out what's going on with the straight line speed. And so again, I go back to, that's got to be one big engine in that Honda, and no disrespect to Adrian Newey, because clearly it's aerodynamically efficient. The car is aerodynamically efficient, but man, that engine, it's something else, man. So that was one thing. I mean, we knew Red Bull had an advantage, but good grief. The other one is Leclerc starts from pit lane on hard tires, and he pitted when some of the early guys on the mediums were pitting. And I think Max went at least another 7 or 8 laps. Now, I don't know if that's, Ferrari once again doing the circular firing squad, but that was the first thing I thought about is that it's sort of like, why did we start on hards to begin with? If you're going to bring him in after the first 17 laps. So anyway, that was a huge surprise to me.
Well, going back to the thing you just said about the Honda engine, it made me think about what we know the deal is for Aston and the Honda, right? And if Aston continues its development efforts and Aston acquires that new Honda engine, what could we be seeing in a few years?
I'm sure Christian Horner is already thinking about that, and probably isn't loving life all that much. And he's also saying, okay, Red Bull powertrains, we're going to have to really, really get it right. That would be my bet. And of course, they still got the Honda people working with them right now. So there's going to be a lot of knowledge transfer, but with the new rules coming in and, they're running on a completely renewable fuel. And, I think they're doing away with one of the power generation units. in the 2026 regulations. So, I mean, the game is definitely going to change, but I'm sure in principle, there's quite a bit of stuff with those hybrid engines that are going to transfer over to the new regulations. Kind of makes you miss, doesn't it, John? The 3-liter normally aspirated formula, and
absolutely
right. You could go buy a Cosworth DFV, stick it in the back, off you go, or
go racing.
Yeah, just go race. Yeah, when the engine wears out, pull it out, stick a new one in, you're done.
Yeah. Yep. It was a thing. I do think that Aston Martin's part of their problem this weekend was that their car, they haven't had enough time to do aerodynamic development like in line with Red Bull and Ferrari and Mercedes probably. But if they get that engine and that, they're really going to be something.
Yep.
And have Alonso still on the team.
Driving at the level he's driving. Yeah.
He says he's going to stay for a few more years, or wants to anyway.
Yeah. I always go back to what Charles Barkley said. He's talking about basketball, but you kind of think it's got to apply to any athlete, right? And that is what Charles said is that father time is whatever and zero. and so how that looks for old Fred, I don't know. I mean, Brady was still pretty effective at 45. So that says to me that Fred's got at least a few years. But then, you look at Mario, the last IndyCar race he won, he was 54. So
amazing. Well, so one of the things that I was thinking about as I listened to the commentary, I think it was for one of the free practice, was they said the speeds we're going to see and the G forces that will result of that. And I thought about the guys that are quote older. I don't really think that they're old, because if I thought they were old, I've got a bit of a problem. But the older guys on the grid and these G forces and them discussing the tension and pressure it puts on the neck, I thought that was interesting considering what we had just seen in Monaco and the procession that everyone talks about that is Monaco. I thought that comparison to have that between weeks. Also, what I noted was that they had said this was the potentially, I think it was Brundle, he wasn't 100% certain, but he said this is the longest straight that we'll see to turn one. And I thought that was kind of fascinating considering that's not the case, right? In Monaco, it's a fairly short run to turn one, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And then of course, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to my question about the track design, but the chicane being removed. I want to go into more details kind of like that. You did talk about the quali and the spins. I wondered not only about what happened over the weekend, but some of the decisions that were made, and specifically the Sonoda penalty. And John, I wondered if you would tell me what you thought about that. And Dick, if you agree or disagree, I feel free to chime in after John's done.
Well, of course, we're talking about lap 14 when, or was it? Yeah, I think it was lap 14 when no, it was lap 56. And Sonoda and Joe were going at it, and Sonoda went down on the inside and Joe was out on the outside. And from all the perspective I saw on it, Sonoda had the corner, and Joe just put himself on the outside. Sonoda never corrected anything at all. He gave him plenty of room going in to that turn, but he had the turn, and so Joe was obligated to back off. He did not. He did take the escape road, but as a consequence of that, his complaint about it to the team went to the stewards, I'm sure, and they gave him a penalty, and I really disagreed with that. I felt like that penalty was undeserved and was not fair.
Why?
Because he gave him room going in, and he was not obligated, from my point of view, to give him the pass. Because it would have taken a great deal of correction for him to leave the racing line, and he had entered the turn first.
Dick, do you agree? Disagree?
Yeah, based on my understanding of the general rules of the road, I think John's got it right. I guess the other thing that I would mention in terms of official decisions and all this kind of stuff is more just the irony of it. When Max was on the hards, he was having a hard time keeping the car within the white lines. of the track. And, he exceeded track limits and they hit him with a 5-second penalty. It made absolutely zero difference in the race outcome. So that was just the other thing I thought was more ironic than anything else, as opposed to what I think is a pretty questionable call on Yuki.
I mean, John, why do you think they did that then? If it's fairly obvious on its face, why do you think the stewards made that penalty decision?
Well, in the same way that a lot of the drivers put themselves off in qualifying when we were surprised, like Alonso, the stewards are subject to mistakes as well. And I think they just made a mistake. That's all.
Yep.
And didn't that put, I'm trying to remember right now, the race standings, didn't that push Tsunoda out of the top 10?
It pushed him out of the points at that time. Let me think about where he finished.
And I kind of asked that.
Yeah, he finished 12th. So it did put him out of the points.
Yeah.
And Joe did finish 9th.
Ooh. And especially considering every one of those points for both of their respective teams would be very valuable.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Ooh. Oh, that's rough. Because I caught a clip of Tsunoda doing, the after race comments, and his face just looked so crestfallen. And I didn't get to hear what he said. I just saw the image, and that explains it. Wow. Rough for Yuki. That's sad. Okay. What about the weather? You guys mentioned it that across free practice, the weather was different, but then also it wasn't different. I mean, did you catch, I'm chuckling. Did you catch Russell telling his strategist, his engineer, oh, it's spitting rain out here. And then like a couple minutes he goes, oh no, wait, it's my sweat. Did you hear that?
Yeah, I heard him talk about, he was interviewed in the post-race conference. And by the way, let me say here, in the post-race conference, I thought that both Russell and Lewis looked incredibly relaxed as compared to their post-race appearance at all of the other races previously. But yeah, Russell said that that was simply, he did two things that caused that. One is he didn't get his balaclava on correctly, and he probably was hurried, and so his hair was kind of hanging down in his face, and then he was starting to sweat. And this tells you a little bit of something about the forces that these guys endure. He said that as the sweat came down on his forehead, that when he would hit the brakes, that the sweat would fly off and spatter on his shield, his face shield. And it looked up for all in the world like rain, except I'm sure after he made the comment, if you're driving in the rain and it goes away, or if you're driving in the rain, period, eventually, if you get up to speed, the shield just clears because of the air, the force of the air. And when that didn't happen, and he still had those drops, he figured out pretty quickly, because he's a smart boy, they were on the inside of his visor, not on the outside.
That is so funny. I mean, I was listening going, is this a race tactic? Is he trying to cause somebody to go jump into the pit and change tires? I was just wondering. And even they showed a clip of Christian Horner putting his hand out and like testing to see if there was rain. And I just thought that was the most comical moment. And then I did think that Mercedes had a good week. I mean, I wrote in my notes changes that they made. It seems like whatever they did back there at the factory, and even Lewis at the end, his remarks as he was crossing the line was thanks to everybody back home. It seems like this is maybe, or is that too early to think this could be bringing Mercedes back into contention? I don't know what your thoughts are, Dick. You want to go first, and then
Sure.
John, you can chime in?
It certainly looks that way, not only for Mercedes, but let's say McLaren and AlphaTauri as well, right? Because there's been big upgrades for all three of those cars. But Barcelona's Barcelona. It's got some unique characteristics. And so I think that we're looking at a step forward for all three of those teams, but we'll only know for sure once we, hit, Montreal and whatever the race is after that. I think you need to get 2 or 3 races and say, okay, what is the actual gap to Red Bull on average before the improvements came out, and then what does it look like now? And so that way, then you can say, okay, did we really make gains on Red Bull or not? I mean, certainly they narrowed the gap in Barcelona. Will that be consistent? That same gap, will that be consistent at Montreal? I mean, we'll know in 2 weeks' time.
John?
Well, it brings up a really interesting topic on development because we're about a third of the way through the season already. It's hard to imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But pretty soon, Red Bull is likely to focus on next year's car and basically to stop development on this car. So Mercedes probably is about a half second in race pace off of Red Bull right now. The others will probably also close in. I expect that Aston Martin will close in at least some, and Ferrari, if they can figure things out and get the right guy shot instead of continuing to shoot each other, I think that they will probably progress too. But the question really then is who's going to make the best progress? And I think if you just look at history, you have to put money on Mercedes simply because they really do it well. They execute well. And I think that the relaxation that you saw post-race with Lewis and Russell is an indicator of where they are, and they are also very confident of the upcoming upgrades being likely in the right direction, since they've gotten some validation at least that the first step has been a positive one. They'll be pretty optimistic. So I think we'll continue to see Mercedes moving closer, closing the gap, challenging, but at the end of the day, I think that it'll be too little too late. And they're going to be concerned, frankly, Mercedes is, about how much more development they do on this car instead of going ahead and focusing on next year's car, because they know that Red Bull is focusing on next year's car.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, especially as you point out the timeline of the calendar and the short time for development, the winter break, summer break, all of that. You have to start getting that done faster. Do you think Aston has that ability? Because doesn't their wind tunnel come online this, like, in a couple of months, or is that at the end of the season? I can't remember right now. I know
they moved into their new facilities. I don't know that the wind tunnel is done yet. Do you know, Dick?
No, it's not done yet. Depending on who you listen to, end of the year, maybe May of next year. Regardless, it's too late for the 2024 car. Yeah, so they're going to have to be back at the Mercedes tunnel. I mean, that's all there is to it. The thing that I think is an interesting question, though, for 2024, we're looking at the third year under this rule set. And so everybody is starting to kind of figure it out to a certain degree, one way or the other. And I think, Red Bull has gotten it so right. How much more are they going to be able to squeeze out of that concept unless there's a rule change? And the percentages for them are going to be a whole lot smaller than it would be for really any of the other teams. But particularly, if you look at Williams and then you compare them to Williams, and it pains me to say Williams is once again, the worst car in the field. Williams is the one that probably is going to find the most gains in their car, and therefore the field's going to tighten up, whereas you can only squeeze so much blood out of a turnip, and I just don't know that they're going to get a whole lot more exploited on the Red Bull design. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, will they go faster? Of course they'll go faster, but will the game be super big? I'm not so sure. I'm kind of wondering.
And you almost kind of wonder if they want to do any further effort of enhancing what they have. Instead, keep that, if they know they can do it, put that on the next year's, so that increases their gain, right? Like, because they already beaten everybody, right? I think we talked about this. Yeah. It's kind of like Max was just racing on his own and everybody else was doing their thing. I mean, I just watched it and went, oh, okay, great for Max. He made it past who was in second slot after quali. I forgot right now. And I went, oh, he made it past him. There's no worry. Let him just go do his race and watch everybody
Oh, it
else.
was Science. Yeah, it was Carlos.
Science. Yeah, that's right. And
Yeah.
because I had a little bit of hope that Carlos could pull it out just fast enough, at least make it a little fun for the people in Barcelona to see him challenge Max.
Mhm.
But Max just got it out. It was done. And so I would, if I were advising them, not that they listen to me because I'm like the new person on the block, doesn't seem like you need to do that. Take all your effort, put it onto the next one, and keep creating that gap, especially as the rules are needing to change. Do you think that this whole mashup of the unusual grid layout is because of this cost cap? It results in that, or was it just the weird quality?
Oh, it was definitely the qualifying session, and frankly, I love this. This is the kind of qualifying I like to see, because it gives you a really good race, especially when we're living through this really special moment where this, once every 20 years or so sort of driver comes to the front. This was not a boring race.
Right.
And Max led flag to flag. He had fastest lap, I guess, in every practice session, fastest lap in qualifying, fastest lap in the race, and won the race. But it wasn't a boring race. And I think that's wonderful for the fans because there's something to really watch and see. It's why I like this kind of qualifying problem where you get things topsy-turvy. But to go just briefly back to this conversation about the development schedule, I think you're right, Sabrina. If I was a betting man and I was running one of these teams, especially the Red Bull team, I would say, let's take the money and put it on next year's car, either now or at the next 1 or 2 races, because Max is like 71 points ahead of Alonso, and he's something in the neighborhood of 85 or 90 points ahead of Lewis. And they're not, with Max as your driver, he's not going to lose every race if you stopped developing the car right now. And if Mercedes and Aston Martin and Ferrari made great breakthroughs, he's still going to win most of those races, or at least take podium positions. So he could continue to lose points at a rate of 2, 3, 4 every weekend, and they would only be closing the gap. It's at some point very, very soon, it's going to be mathematically unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely that anybody's going to overtake him.
And then going back to what you said, as this whole idea of them all trying to get in there in a little bit of contention, that creates the quote drama that everyone wants to have. Like, will they? Can they? Which for those who are coming into the sport and want to see that kind of competitive, not snooze fest when we think about the overall winning, right? Not the week by week or race by race. It actually might be nice and smart for Red Bull to say, let's move over and focus there, because that will only spice up things and drive attention to see who can beat our guy, when you really know that the quality of the car will prevent that from really ever happening.
Well, Dick and I both know that they would never take that attitude. They really don't care what the show is like. They care about winning the championship.
Really? You don't think they care at all about the drama to the Red Bull?
Do you hear Dick laughing?
Yeah, I do. Oh, that's interesting to me. Okay, from a marketing perspective, I would think they would want to be able to talk about that kind of stuff, but I see it. Yeah, because it is the racing competitiveness aspect. Okay, I concede the point. Okay, on the other side of the Red Bull garage, Perez, though, if we're talking about them looking about winning the constructors, can they feel that level of confidence with Perez? He worked so hard to overtake, it seemed like, this race. And then after last week's sad performance for him.
Well, Horner was very supportive of him after the race. I really am concerned that Perez has gotten himself in a bad place after last weekend. The manufacturers championship, they could still lose if he doesn't get his act together. I think he will.
Yeah.
Not terribly concerned about that. They're 120 to 30, 40 points ahead of Mercedes, the next place team and the manufacturers, but he needs to get back on song, and he needs to help them out, because those points, especially if Mercedes is moving up to second and third, or third and fourth every race, they'll chip into that manufacturers championship pretty quickly.
That made me think of something about Mercedes when you said that. Lewis hasn't signed yet, right, to continue his contract. So I wonder, Dick, and you can talk about him or reply to this question I'm about to ask, and or the Perez part. Do you think that this is just going to make Lewis decide to stay with Mercedes, with all this talk about Ferrari, which none of us really thought he would ever go to Ferrari? But after this weekend's upgrades and the development and that confidence that you guys have stated about putting your money on Mercedes being able to figure this out, and the future car, do you think he'll resign? And then Perez's future, what do you think? Do you think he can continue to bring performances for Red Bull to get them the constructors?
So two good questions, I think. And I think the cynic in me says that now that that Mercedes has delivered a car that Hamilton is clearly much more happy with, because remember, he used to say, oh, I just can't drive this car, right? And now all of a sudden, oh, I can drive this car. I kind of would say that he'll probably be a whole lot more willing to sign a contract, because surely he can look down pit road and see what's going on at Ferrari and say, I don't want any part of that. So that's the first part. The second part is, I am a big believer in Sergio as a really, really solid number two, because most of the time, and I say most of the time, he delivers exactly what Red Bull needs from him. Yes, he's had some bad races, but you know what? We all have bad races, except apparently Max at this stage. But everybody else, I mean, even Fernando's making mistakes. As experienced as he is, you know, he didn't have a weekend to write home about. And so it's going to happen. And so I think Horner understands that. The other side of it, though, is that, you know, I've talked to several other fans, you know, based here in the local area, and some of them are starting to say, you watch, after the summer break, Ricardo's in the car. And it's an interesting deal, because for sure, I'm willing to bet that Ricardo and Sergio are not going out and having dinner in the middle of the week, hanging out and being bros. I think Sergio has got to feel a little bit of that pressure there.
Well, I mean, yeah, I've said that to you guys. My question has always been was Daniel brought in to create that pressure on Sergio to go, you did sign for this year, but there is no assurance, especially with how cutthroat it seems to be Red Bull can be. But I almost wonder if that's part of the reason why he is struggling, that when he has the confidence that I have a team behind me and I don't have to like overperform, is he in his head now thinking I've got my seat is no longer assured? Kind of like some of the stuff that, as we've talked about Charles, and we can talk about that as well here if you guys want, about this weekend. I mean, no one is shocked when I repeat the fact that I'm a Charles fangirl. I was like, what's going on? Is it the car? Is it Charles? The quali, not even getting out of Q1. I felt so bad for him. And then the decisions that they're making, I just couldn't figure out what to attribute that to. So can you guys help me with that question? So I think, Dick, you talked just a minute ago, so I'll throw it to John, to be fair.
Well, I think that the problem, and thank you for being fair. Dick and I are most concerned about fairness.
Oh, yeah, totally.
I
don't want you saying I make bad calls like the stewards. So,
well, I'll throw a flag on you if you deserve it.
She makes a point.
The thing with Charles right now, I mean, perhaps he's right, but he believed after free practice and going into qualifying, and certainly during qualifying, and then I think in the race, he believes that there's something wrong with his chassis, his car. And So therefore, he's not able to be fully confident and to commit in the car. And he may be right, but the team is looking very carefully at all these things. I think Charles even demanded it. So I just think, well, Dick made the point about him starting from pit road. So I think that he's suffering from some of the morale problem that's going on in the team. And either the car is just so terrible, which is a real possibility, and now he's under threat because Sainz is able to extract a fair amount out of the car.
Yep.
And he was not able at all. But sometimes this is a confidence issue inside the driver's head. And if they become convinced that there's something wrong with the car, Seb Vettel had this from time to time. But if he has confidence that, or if he doesn't have confidence in the car, it makes it very difficult for him to make the kind of commitment that's necessary to do a lap.
When did Zeb have that problem? Was it when he was at Aston or when he was with Ferrari?
When he was with Ferrari.
Oh, well, that doesn't bode well. Oh, that's like disappointing. Because I mean, as I was watching quali and the race, I thought they had different upgrades. I mean, they brought upgrades, right? When they talk about upgrades, they don't do different upgrades on each car. So I couldn't understand why Carlos seemed to be figuring this out and Charles was struggling. So what you're saying feels like that could be the answer, which makes me very sad for him. Am I right? They can't do different upgrades on each car.
Well, sometimes they do if they like at Haas, but Ferrari has greater assets than that. So, I mean, Dick may have a different perspective on this problem, but that's mine.
Yeah, Dick, what are your thoughts?
So there's no question that if the driver's head is not there, you ain't going to go fast. And I don't think there's any question that right now, Charles is either doubting the car, doubting himself, or doubting both. All right. So there's that to consider. But if you take a step back and say, okay, let's say that Charles and Carlos are pretty evenly matched. Each has different strengths and weaknesses, but generally speaking, they're pretty evenly matched. Well, Carlos qualified second fastest, which says to me that maybe, like John said, that Carlos and his side of the garage figured it out. But what if there's a dead shock or a partially dead shock? That's really hard to chase. I mean, I'm not saying it's a shock, but I mean, it could be something like that. I've seen situations where there were suspension links that were actually a little bit shorter than spec. Somebody made a mistake and it was shorter than spec. And so what was happening was that the suspension was bottoming out before the car actually bottomed out in a corner, and it caused the spring rate on the car to go to, like to infinity, go from a 900-pound spring to a, infinity pound spring. So, I mean, there's little fundamental stuff like that. Or maybe they need to take an x-ray machine and x-ray the tub itself, because maybe there's a crack in there that they have not detected and the car is actually twisting under load. It's happened before, but it's incredibly difficult to chase down. And so if you give Charles the benefit of the doubt and say, you know what, you give this guy a good car and he's fast, maybe it really is the car. In the meantime, we'll go find a good sports psychologist for him too.
Yep, that's the right approach. And Sabrina, when I mentioned the words, the stuff about Seb, there were occasions when, and I think it happened at Red Bull too, when Seb was right and there was a crack in the monocoque or something. But there were also times when he was wrong. But it's like Dick was saying, it's where the guy's head is.
Do you think that, okay, so it sounds like if it was any of those things, that it could present itself during free practice, but there's no way you can really run all that kind of diagnostics. And then also, of course, we know with quali, you can't make any of those kinds of changes, right? So that it kind of is a wash for your weekend, but we do have a little bit of time before our next race. Is there a time for them to diagnose and fix that kind of, if there's any of those, let's pretend, any of the ones that you've listed, do they have time to diagnose and then fix that before the next race, you think?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
As soon as the car is back in the shop, you can bet they're going to be going through it.
They're going to go through it. But then that goes back.
Nut and bolts.
Okay. But then that goes back to a different component of our conversation earlier, I guess, Is that the best use of your time when you need to be developing for the next year? Because wouldn't Ferrari be in the same position as Aston and Mercedes of thinking, okay, we're a third of the way through. We need to be thinking about our next car's development. We need to be using our resources and our people towards that. Or is it worth, especially I guess I'm just trying to think, how would you weigh this all out? Maybe in their minds, it could be worth the time of investing in this, because if you can help your driver get out of his head and perform better, that's a more of a long-term investment of your ability to do this. Because it seems like if it's not the car and it is his head, then he's spiraling, and you got to stop that because you've got him driving your car. Do you see where I'm kind of like trying to analyze this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my answer is that you're absolutely right. They've made a huge annual investment in Charles. Mm-hmm. And his head needs to be right. There's no question about it. Whatever is driving it, his head needs to be right. The other side, as far as, stripping the car down and going through it, that would be the race team. That's not the engineering department that's developing the new car. So it's a totally separate group of guys that are doing that particular piece of work versus the development pieces or the design of the new 2024 car. So yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things, you just go do it.
Okay. Oh, okay. So there's hope that maybe this could get fixed in the next few weeks, or at least get Charles back onto, I don't even know that I would make them distinct. Charles needs to get into the better mental pathway to whatever needs to happen to help him win, or to at least drive better. And then the car needs to be addressed. And then that is segmented away from the development of the next Ferrari car.
Yeah.
Okay. I know we talked a lot about Charles. I'm sorry. I know.
It's okay.
Okay. I think it's a fascinating example of how you have a team that's historically at the front, has such a name ID, have a driver that many, I think, have said that is an excellent driver, and to see him not performing, it's like the problem solver in me just wants to, outside of the fan part, wants to understand how this could happen.
Right. Yeah, it's a head scratcher. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, let's talk about rookies really quick, because I think that it was an interesting race when we think about them. Any of them that are notable, both for good, excellent performances, not so great, you have concerns about? Dick, you want to go first?
Sure. I think both Piastri and De Vries are showing that they're really progressing pretty nicely. They've had, they both showed well. They had good races. Logan Sargent, I think, again, a little bit of a mixed bag in that, he damaged the car in qualifying, wasn't so great, and had to start from pit lane. His teammate did not have to start from pit lane. And yet, if you go and you look at the results and all that kind of stuff, Sargent actually acquitted himself quite well against a driver that's held in fairly high regard in terms of Albon, in terms of how the race turned out. Because, I mean, you start from pit lane, that is one huge disadvantage, and yet he came up, and I don't know where the final number of seconds were that he was behind Albon, but it certainly wasn't all that much, really, considering where he started. And so I think he did himself some credit there. And I'll say this on a car that really isn't very good when the road turns. Right?
Which is tough on a road racing circuit.
Yeah, it's a bullet in a straight line, but it's it's not the best when you have to hit the brakes and turn the steering wheel. So
yeah.
Well, and especially this track, it had some really substantial turns. John, what are your thoughts?
Definitely impressed with Piastri in particular. De Vries, I'm still kind of on the fence about. I think he's going to make it. I think he's going to be fine. But Piastri, I thought, just delivered a great performance in qualifying and a good performance in the race. Sargent, I continue to have concerns about him. I want him to do really well, and I continue to have concerns. I think Dick is absolutely right. His relative performance to Albon compared to his experience is really good. And I noticed particularly in this race that Albon's fastest lap was 1:19.1, and Sargent's fastest lap was 1:19.2. So he's putting in the times. He just needs to. whether it's better focus, better qualifying practice performance, just more experience is probably the big thing. But he's not doing bad work. He's just he needs results, or I think he's going to come under pressure for his position.
Like when you say more experience, you mean like mileage? Like he just literally just needs to drive inside that car more.
Yeah, Albon's been in Formula One for how many years, Dick? I can't remember now, but it's 4 or 5. Maybe?
Yeah, 4 or 5 years. Yeah, for sure.
That's mileage.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. Okay, what do you think were any notable performances this week?
Two ones that I would note. One is Alonso. His performance I thought was good, but his commitment and pass on Ocon on lap 50 was breathtakingly committed. And I just, that's one of the reasons that people just love the guy, is he is a racer to the core. And that was a hard pass. And he was totally committed to it. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. The other one I would mention is Max. And, Max, we tend to not focus on Max because he's just running away with everything and he looks like nobody can touch him. And, he got in trouble for exceeding track limits, 3 times. And Toto got on the phone and told him to hush up and stop doing that and behave himself. I'm sorry, Horner. Mm-hmm. And the next lap, he goes even faster and sets fastest lap. They told him he didn't need to do it. Everything was good, but he just cannot stop himself, and he's got performance to burn, and he put in a great performance.
Yeah, he did.
Dick, what are your thoughts?
I think pretty much along the same lines of what John was talking about. I think the thing that I would add is that I'm starting to wonder a little bit about Ocon's judgment, because he does some stuff every once in a while that I can't decide if he really is that brave, or is there something missing there with that guy? Because he does some stuff where you kind of go, Alonso was in the pit exit to make that pass. It was because Ocon shoved him down that way. And I'm kind of like, if you were doing
the speed
that,
differential was undoubtedly in Alonso's favor.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this is an F1 topic here we're talking, but can you imagine somebody doing that in IndyCar?
Dangerous.
You'd be killing people with that kind of deal.
Yeah.
And so, I just think that there's a lack of respect on his part, or bad judgment, or maybe he really is that brave and that leads to stupidity. I'm not really sure. It's one of those, though.
Do you think it's maybe immaturity and hostility to a former teammate, like whatever might have been latent resentment from the years that they were? Because didn't we talk about this in the past, that Alonso is very challenging to work with, but he asks a lot of people, and how that might have been to a younger driver. Like, I think the Alonso Ocon matchup to me seems to be different than the Alonso Lance matchup of personalities and relationship. And it almost seems like Ocon might have been frustrated and angered, like your kid brother who doesn't really like you. And then you have the kid brother who does like you and looks up to you and just wants to follow in your footsteps. And you, like, if you have 3 brothers,
I didn't know you knew my kid brother.
I won't ask which one he is, if he's Lance or if he's Ocon. But it just seemed like when I watched that, I thought, are you frustrated with him right now by behaving that way? Yeah, that's what I thought.
And I think there's probably something to it.
Yeah.
Alonso helped Ocon win the Hungarian Grand Prix a couple of years ago, because he held off Lewis for long enough that Ocon was able to, stretch out a lead and then hang on and win the race. So Alonso, he kind of owes Fred a little bit, but on the other hand, last year, Ocon had pretty good reliability on that Alpine, but Fred didn't, and Ocon scored more points than Fred. And at the end of the year, Fred was saying things like, well, yeah, but, I broke down, 7 times, and Ocon only broke down twice. You get me finishing an extra 5 races, and I finish ahead of him in the world championship standings. And I'm sure that rankled Ocon just a little bit, which, I get it, but Fred's not wrong either, so anyway.
Well, that goes back to the psychological warfare we've talked about
Oh, yeah.
these guys, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. The last thing I'd like to chat about, and then we'll get going, is what are your thoughts about the track design and how it affected this race? I know that I think in one of the practices, or maybe in quali, the commentators were highlighting or substantial speeds that the G forces overall would be something to be very strong compared to, I think they said across all the races that we'll be seeing over this year, just the cumulative effect of all this, especially with that chicane removed. I don't know if you liked that chicane being removed out of there. And then they said that we should be expecting some really good overtakes. And again, I noted this earlier in comparison to Monaco. I thought that was fascinating to have that 1 week almost whiplash, of not having many overtakes, and now here getting to watch that and have that exciting aspect. What are y'all's thoughts? Dick, I think it's your turn.
Okay. Number one, I'm a big fan of them taking that silly chicane out and let them just rip through those last two corners. Formula One should be about speed, and 170 miles an hour, I think, at the apex of the last turn onto the main straight. You know, I mean, as a driver and as a fan, man, I like it. You know, I really do.
Did you like the camera every time they would show them whipping around that corner?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, every time I was like, oh, that's so fun. Keep going, keep going. I wanted to see them keep coming around that corner. And when they looked like they would go off, I was like, no, keep going. Let's see that energy. It was beautiful. That's the only word I can think of. Yeah.
Right. Which then would probably led to higher terminal speeds down that big long straightaway, because you're going through the last turn so much faster, right? So that was fun. But I think the front tires had to be really, really taken care of, or they would just take an absolute canning, because there's lots of long corners where you're pulling big time G's. And so I think the front tires have to be cared for. And those who did it better, I think, you know, the race probably had greater benefit just because of the pace that they could maintain. But I also think, you know, the other piece is that when you're pulling those high of G's and that sort of thing, certainly the drivers are feeling it. You know, I mean, I've pulled enough G's just in the kind of racing that I do, where I wind up weighing, you know, 500 or 600 pounds for, you know, half a second or something like that. But you know what, when you're weighing that much, you still have to steer the car, and you still have to get it, you know, absolutely precise on the racetrack, or it's really going to hurt, because, you know, you're going to make a mistake, miss the corner, and off you go, and maybe into a barrier or something like that. And so, you know, this track, because of how it's designed, puts an awful lot of physical stress on the drivers, not just their neck, but also, you know, the forearms and all the other, even core, you know, especially core, because you've got to be able to work against those G forces and drive with the level of precision that those cars require. So it's quite a test, I think.
So then, just trying to make sure I'm connecting some pieces for myself. I don't know if it's correct or not. So are you saying that when they're going into the gravel, like they did in quali, right, with those spins that we saw, not just the spins, but the actual gravel, that is they're really going to feel that.
I mean, they're going to be bouncing, and I mean, those are some pretty high speed bounces. So I'm guessing their lower backs definitely feel that. Certainly it's not like, you know, smacking a barrier or something like that. Last weekend at the Indy 500, a guy got upside down at, I don't know, 200 miles an hour or whatever, and his initial impact was 80 G's. Think about that. I would be willing to bet that, like, the big off that Max had a couple of years ago at Silverstone when he and Lewis got together, I'm sure it was at least 80 G's when he went in and hit. You know, I mean, it's a bunch, even though they're strapped in and their heads are, you know, in many respects locked in so they can't have the whiplash. The other piece is that you don't want to have that big head movement in a crash like that, because your brains literally slosh against your
Right.
skull. And so, you need to minimize that head movement all the way. So don't know if I've answered your question, but yeah, I mean, those are all things that have to be taken, into very serious consideration.
Yeah, I just think as a spectator who's not ever been inside of a racing situation, it's hard to imagine what the physical toll, especially when you see them going at those fast speeds, and you're sitting there going, "Go again, do it again." So pretty to watch,
Right.
You don't
Right.
realize the impact. John, what are your thoughts about the track design, how it affected this race?
Well, I think I really agree with Dick, and I'm a racer too, and I just think faster is better, but in so many ways. But
Amen.
you have to go back to why the chicane was there in the first place, because they really took it back to an earlier configuration. And the reason they put it in there was to try and get more passing. And what they proved was it really didn't help with passing. It was just slowing them down. And so putting this back in, I agree, it makes a faster speed going into turn one. The cars, especially now that they're a little bit less draggy, they can follow each other a little closer, and there's a much greater opportunity for passing, slipstreaming and passing, which is what Alonso did to Ocon. Yeah, so I think that the change in the track layout really worked to give us a great race. And when you added in the qualifying situation where the weather was all changey and we got a jumbled up grid, we got a lot of action. We got to see a really great driver lead the field and show us a command performance, and we got to see a lot of really good driving and passing. It was very interesting and exciting race.
Yep.
I like that. I think that's a great way to end our conversation, is that maybe Barcelona doesn't necessarily, when you talk about all the different circuits, so it may not be the one that everyone would put at the top of their list, but it's maybe an undervalued track, especially now that this change is there. And I look forward to seeing what it's going to look like in years to come. That ends this conversation. But rest assured, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just two guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, thanks for listening.